right, well, we are going to roll right into our next keynote address, and this is from Congressman Dan Bishop. Congressman Bishop's family has hailed for generations from Bladen County in North Carolina. That's the eastern end of Congressman Bishop's district, which is North Carolina's 9th congressional district. He was born and currently lives in Charlotte, still part of that district, at the western end. He brings to the House an impressive background in policymaking, legal work, and commitment to conservative North Carolina values. Before coming to Congress, to the U.S. Congress, Congressman Bishop was in the North Carolina General Assembly, where he fought to keep North Carolina families safe from dangerous sanctuary city policy. He also cut taxes, limited spending, reduced family health care costs, invested in public schools, expanded school choice, safeguarded the Second Amendment, and much more. And he brings all of those values to the United States Congress. Congressman Bishop holds bachelor's in law degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm sure that he is thrilled about their Final Four run this year. And after graduating law school in 1990, he served business clients in the private sector for 29 years. He is a relative newcomer to Congress. Congressman Bishop won a close, high-profile special election in September of 2019. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Dan Bishop.
Thanks, Emil. I'm glad to be with you guys. You know, last Thursday at the Republican Conference retreat in Florida, we had a retreat lunch speaker, Condoleezza Rice. And in a Q&A, most members of the Republican Conference who asked questions amplified her theme of the robust action that she suggested should be expected from the United States confronting the situation in Ukraine. She especially had a focus in her comments on condemnation of Vladimir Putin. It was a special focus. I thought it might be interesting to liven the conversation up since it was all going in one direction, and I asked whether the Bush administration policy in Afghanistan and Iraq and how it played out offer any perspective for how we should face the situation in Ukraine. Her answer was, in essence, that we had no choice but to invade Afghanistan, that it was a resounding success, and that people say Afghanistan is our longest war, but Korea was a longer war, and that we had bought stability in both places. She said the world is better off without Saddam Hussein. And the one caution she offered is that the administration should have prepared the American people for a much longer effort, much longer occupation. Maybe an occupation not of 20 years and $6 trillion, but that should have been thought of as just getting started. Perhaps 50 years, perhaps 75 years. That was the example she gave in Korea. I think there are two significant points in sitting in that lunch and listening to a very accomplished woman speak to us about those issues, and they were to me that I don't think Americans would agree with her, number one. And number two, that Condoleezza Rice, with the history of the Bush administration and the lessons of history that I believe it has taught, was the person who someone thought members of the Republican Conference should be listening to about about Ukraine. The truth is that in foreign policy, both parties have been speaking with one voice for decades. And let's be clear, U.S. foreign policy in the Mideast, in Afghanistan and Iraq, has been a disaster. Afghanistan was an historic failure capped off by the most striking picture of American weakness in history, more so even than the helicopter lifting off the embassy in Vietnam. And that'll be remembered for years. Those killed outside the walls of Kabul airport never saw the World Trade Center. Their lives ended in a conflict that started before they were born. And yet, for some reason, it is often true that the same experts appear to hold sway in conservative thought. Now, Donald Trump deserves and gets credit for breaking the neocon Republican orthodoxy, and I'm grateful to him for it. I am not an isolationist, but I also am not an interventionist. The same is true of President Trump. He articulated a simple policy, which I also embrace: America first. To me, another term for that is common sense. America's foreign policy should serve the needs of the American people. So should our domestic policy, by the way. So there are lessons from President Trump, both of style and of substance. Number one, we must break away from groupthink. We must have the courage to stand outside war fever when it strikes and ask questions and show courage. And two, we must resist misdirecting the power of federal government from higher priorities to lower ones, especially when we do that by facilitating concentrations of power in the executive. So, we had a couple of votes in the last couple of weeks on the subject of Ukraine, and you guys heard from Thomas Massey, my friend from Kentucky, earlier today. And Thomas is the standard that we all should live by. But we had two votes. We had a vote on importation of Russian oil. We also had a vote on trade relations with Russia and Belarus. I was one of 8 Republicans that voted against the trade sanctions bill, and I also voted against the Russian importation of Russian oil bill, with a few more on my side. When we had the second vote on the Russia and Belarus trade relations bill, a newspaper back home in my district said that I joined the Vladimir Putin wing of the Republican Party and that I lacked sober judgment. Now, that was good for a laugh, as far as I'm concerned. To the contrary, that trade sanctions bill was another blank check of power to the executive, to the president, that will never go away. Remember that the President of the United States continues to rely on the 2001 authorization for the use of military force now in 2022 for some of the operations the United States engages in. That's been there for that many years. In the case of the trade sanctions bill, it imparted to the president unilateral power to set tariff rates for both those nations, Belarus and Russia. And in the bill, if you actually read it, as Thomas Massey did, and I did, and I guess 6 others who voted against it, it also said that although it set a deadline for that, or a time for that authority to expire, January 2024, the president can renew that authority on his own forever. It will never go away until the Congress musters a 2/3 vote to overcome a presidential veto and recover that power. It also took what you've heard, the Magnitsky Act, that authorizes the president acting unilaterally to impose sanctions on anyone, anywhere in the world, any foreign person. It took away the standards that limit the exercise of that authority and replaced it with a fuzzy, undefined standard. And importantly, it repealed the sunset on that law as well. So Congress never gets another look at it unless Congress passes a law and sustains it with over a veto in order to recover that power. We've done that time and time and time again. And yet the same bill, when it addressed the World Trade Organization, spoke in the most timid of terms, that our trade representatives should be instructed to request the World Trade Organization to suspend trade concessions in favor of Russia and Belarus. And also that we should encourage the WTO to consider other action. no conditions, no demands, nothing for that globalist group. More recognition or concession to weakness of the United States Congress. More granting blank checks. Or if you consider the oil ban that I also voted against, the oil importation ban, it had no effect for 45 days, and it failed to take the steps necessary to reinvigorate American domestic energy production. Republicans could have forced that to be in that legislation, but we did not. My view is that the Republican conference must have members who will not be stampeded, must have the courage to withstand war fever. And we can't be distracted from our top priorities by war fever. Consider the American southern border today. We were just in a hearing this morning, as a matter of fact, in which Border Patrol was describing drone flights over the Mexican-American border. 30,000 flights over the last 6 months, 4,300 drones operating in that area. Didn't break it down by how many were crossing the southern border, but what they were saying is that Mexican cartels are using drones to carry drugs across the border. You think about how much fentanyl could be carried by a drone, that they're using heavier versions of drones, and that they constantly use drones to monitor how Border Patrol is organized, where they're focusing on, so that they can facilitate smuggling efforts. And I asked them after a long hearing, and they were talking about renewing some authority that they needed, but it seemed to me the obvious question is, what reason is there to permit drones to operate back and forth across the American border? What in the world is the American government that has the responsibility to protect American interests doing, allowing that? And it was almost as if, I had said something outrageous in the room. But that is, again, we see all too often in Washington, the priorities lost and groupthink take hold that determines how our nation operates, and all too often American people are disserved by it. But I believe when it comes to words like that editorialist in the paper back home, it is allowing circumstances like that to continue that reflects the absence of sober judgment. It is sober judgment combined with courage that resists the war drums when they are pounding. Candidate Trump bashed stupid leaders and stupid generals. He bashed so-called experts, and that resonated with the American people. The United States faces a decisive moment. Are we going to embrace America first, common sense, or will we return to the failed foreign policy orthodoxy of the past? We must avoid another world war, of course. But we hope that future generations will look back and mark this as a time when cooler heads prevailed, when common sense prevailed, when consideration of the interests of the American people prevailed and averted a crisis. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to be with you.